This is Miss Eleanor at Relational Map, and today we are conducting a thought experiment. I have learned something from years of watching these conversations play out. When you explain male suffering directly, people dismiss it, minimize it, or simply lack the emotional framework to absorb it. The data does not land. The statistics do not move people. Lived experience descriptions get labeled as complaining. So today we try a different approach. We flip everything. Every disadvantage, every double standard, every area where men are treated as disposable or irrelevant or unworthy of concern. We take each one and ask a single question. What would happen if this were happening to women instead? Not as an attack, not as bitterness, as a genuine mirror. Sometimes the only way to make invisible suffering visible is to ask people to imagine it happening to someone they care about. Our society has made it clear that it cares about women's suffering in ways it does not care about men's suffering. So let us hold up that mirror and see what reflects back. I want to be clear about tone before we start. This is not rage. This is not a war cry. This is a calm examination of double standards so normalized we have stopped seeing them as double standards. Men live inside these things daily. They are so woven into male existence that most men no longer recognize them as injustices. They accept them as the price of being a man. My name is Miss Eleanor. This is Relational Map. The price is about to become visible. The draft and disposability. Every young man in this country turns 18 and the law requires him to register for selective service. Required, not requested. Under penalty of losing federal student loans, federal employment, and potential criminal charges. The registration exists for one purpose, so that if the government needs bodies to send into combat, it knows where to find them. Women are not required to register. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate legal distinction built on a principle so embedded in our culture we barely notice it. In a crisis, men's lives are available to be spent. Women's lives are not. Now imagine the reverse. Imagine women were legally required to register at 18. Imagine failure to register cost them federal benefits and risked prosecution. Imagine that in wartime, women would be directed to combat roles without the option to decline. The organized opposition would be unlike anything in modern political history. Legal challenges reaching the Supreme Court within weeks. Marches that would make previous demonstrations look modest. Emergency legislative sessions. Every major outlet would treat it as the defining civil rights issue of the generation, and they would be right to do so, because it is a profound thing to say to any human being. Your life is available to be claimed by the state. Your body can be sent somewhere it may be killed. You have no vote in this. You simply have to be available. That is what we say to 18-year-old boys. We say it so casually that the young men receiving it barely register it as the extraordinary thing it actually is. Welcome to adulthood. Sign here to confirm your life belongs to us if we need it. If we would not say this to women, we need to ask why we say it to men without a second thought. Dying at work. 5,000 men die in workplace accidents in this country every single year. 5,000. That is 5,000 families losing a father, a brother, a husband, a son. 5,000 funerals. 5,000 lives ended by the work they were doing. These deaths concentrate in construction, mining, logging, fishing, agriculture, transportation. Physically dangerous jobs. Jobs that happen to be overwhelmingly male. Jobs where the economic calculation apparently favors absorbing a certain level of worker death over the cost of making conditions safer. Now imagine those 5,000 deaths were women dying on the job. Imagine the news coverage, the congressional hearings, the regulatory investigations, the OSHA overhauls, the documentaries, the advocacy organizations that would appear overnight demanding accountability. We know exactly what would happen because we have seen how society responds when female safety is at risk. The response is immediate, comprehensive, and treated as a moral emergency. When men die on the job, companies pay settlements, file the required paperwork, and the world moves on. The men who do that dangerous work, who accept physical risk as part of daily life because someone has to and because it pays what it pays, are not treated as people making extraordinary sacrifices. They are a line item. 5,000 funerals a year. And the conversation barely registers it. Living shorter lives. Men die approximately 5 to 6 years before women. 5 to 6 years of life women have that men do not. That gap is grandchildren growing up. Years of retirement, relationships, time. The reasons are multiple. Men take more physical risks, work more dangerous jobs, are less likely to seek medical care, more likely to die by suicide. All of it feeds into a mortality gap that has persisted across generations. Ask yourself honestly, if women were dying 5 to 6 years earlier than men, would we be having calm academic discussions about contributing factors? Or would we treat it as a public health emergency, demanding immediate attention and substantial resources? The answer is obvious. We have seen how society responds to female health disparities. Research funding follows, public campaigns follow, policy follows. The machinery of social concern mobilizes fast. For men dying years earlier, the response amounts to this. Men make certain choices, men take certain risks. There are reasons for this. The implicit message being that the gap is explainable, which apparently makes it acceptable. A gap being explainable and a gap being acceptable are two completely different things. We have never required female health disparities to be unexplainable before treating them as worthy of serious attention. The same standard should apply to men. I want to add something here that the standard version of this conversation leaves out. A significant portion of the male mortality gap is not inevitable. It is socially produced. Men present to doctors later because the culture around them treats help seeking as weakness. Men do not access mental health support until they are in crisis rather than when early intervention could prevent the crisis. Men absorb injuries and physical exposures that shorten their lives while this gets treated as simply the cost of being male. We are not observing a gap. We are producing one and choosing not to address it. The legal system. Research consistently shows men receive sentences approximately 60% longer than women for committing equivalent crimes. Not slightly different. Not marginally different. 60% for the same offense. Imagine the disparity ran the other direction. Imagine women receiving sentences 60% longer than men for identical crimes. The response is not hypothetical. We've seen how the system responds when female defendants face perceived systemic bias. The response is immediate, vigorous, and treated as a fundamental justice issue. When the disparity runs the other direction, the research exists, the data is published, and the policy response is silence. Family court operates on similar logic. Men who dedicated decades to building a family, who were present fathers and faithful providers, who did everything society asked of them, walk into a courtroom and discover the default assumption is that their children belong with their mother. The burden falls on the father to prove why he deserves equal time with children he helped create and has been raising for years. If women walked into family court and discovered the default was that fathers received primary custody 80% of the time, that mothers were given weekend visitation and expected to be grateful that a decade of marriage and motherhood could end with a settlement requiring them to pay financial support to an ex-husband who had already moved on, there would be no court system intact by morning. The response would be immediate, organized, and uncompromising. That response would be justified because what I just described is deeply unjust. It is also exactly what happens to men every day in courtrooms across this country, with very little organized opposition, because men have been conditioned to accept injustice in silence rather than name it and fight it. Education. Women attend and graduate from college at rates approximately 20 percentage points higher than men. For every 100 women pursuing a degree, roughly 80 men do the same. The gap is widening. When the educational gap ran the other direction decades ago, the response was exactly what you would expect. Title IX. Scholarship programs for women. Targeted recruiting. Institutional changes designed to level a playing field perceived as tilted against female students. The system mobilized. Now the gap has reversed and grown larger. Boys fall behind in primary and secondary school. They're less likely to graduate high school, less likely to attend college, more likely to drop out if they do. The policy response is nothing, because the narrative of male disadvantage in education does not fit comfortably into the frameworks that govern education policy discussions. Boys continue falling behind year after year, while the mechanisms that mobilize to help girls thrive remain dormant. This matters beyond the classroom. The generation of men significantly less educated than their female peers will be, in 20 years, less equipped to contribute as providers, partners, and fathers. The educational gap we are failing to address is a slow-moving social crisis. Its full impact has not arrived yet. But it is coming. Men dying by their own hands. Men die by suicide at approximately 4 times the rate of women, not slightly more. 4 times. This is one of the most devastating statistics in public health. It represents an incalculable amount of suffering. Families losing fathers, sons, brothers. A crisis of despair playing out at scale and largely in silence. Imagine those numbers reversed. Imagine women dying by suicide at 4 times the rate of men. Think about the research funding that would mobilize, the public awareness campaigns, the policy changes, the crisis infrastructure that would be built. Think about how it would dominate the cultural conversation for years. For men, the response has been modest relative to the scale. Not in an extent. Modest. Male suicide gets treated as a men's issue rather than a human crisis, and men's issues do not receive the same urgency as equivalent issues affecting women. The reason men die by suicide at 4 times the rate is not simply that men are more depressed. It is that men choose more lethal methods. And a significant reason men choose more lethal methods is that they spent their entire lives being told that reaching for help is weakness. By the time a man reaches a suicidal crisis, he is not reaching for intervention. He is reaching for an ending. Because he was taught his whole life that the appropriate response to suffering is to handle it alone and quietly. The 4-to-1 ratio is not just a number, it is the measurable cost of a cultural message delivered to men from childhood. Add to this that men make up over 70% of the homeless population. More than 7 out of 10 people sleeping on streets, in shelters, under bridges are men. Men who lost their homes, their families, their financial stability, their footing. If 70% of homeless people were women, we would treat it as one of the defining social failures of our era. Male homelessness at 4 times the rate of female homelessness is background noise. Violence against men. Men constitute approximately 75 to 80% of homicide victims in this country. The overwhelming majority of people being murdered are men. Yet the cultural conversation about violence focuses almost entirely on violence against women, which is a genuine crisis deserving serious attention. The problem is that male victims exist in numbers that dwarf comparable female statistics, and those men are largely invisible in the conversation. When a woman is murdered, the community mobilizes. Investigators work the case with intensity. The story gets covered. That is as it should be. Every murder victim deserves that response. When an ordinary man is killed going about his ordinary life, the response is far more muted. A note in a police report. Perhaps a brief mention in local coverage. The story moves on because male victims of violence generate less social concern than female victims. And we have normalized that disparity so thoroughly we rarely examine it. How men are portrayed. Turn on any sitcom. Watch a family-focused commercial. The husband who cannot figure out the dishwasher. The father who creates disasters when left alone with the children for an afternoon. The bumbling man-child who requires his competent, eye-rolling wife to manage every aspect of domestic life. The comic relief whose defining characteristic is his inadequacy. If this genre existed for women, the response would be immediate. Boycotts. Advertiser withdrawals. Industry condemnations. Organized campaigns. Lawsuits alleging harmful stereotypes. The recognition that systematically portraying any group as incompetent buffoons causes real harm, shapes cultural perception, and affects how that group sees itself. The question is not whether male negative stereotyping causes harm. It does. The question is why it is acceptable when the target is male, when the identical content would be a social crisis if the target were female. The man-up standard. Every man internalizes this from childhood. When things are hard, handle it. When you are in pain, manage it. When you need help, find a way to need it less. Do not complain. Do not cry. Do not ask for sympathy. Solve the problem and keep moving. This expectation produces capable, resilient men who contribute enormously to their families and societies. It also produces men who suffer alone because they have been told their entire lives that suffering out loud is weakness. Men who do not seek medical help until conditions are severe because seeking help feels like failure. Men who carry impossible weights in silence and eventually break because they never learned it was acceptable to put the weight down and ask for help carrying it. Imagine applying this standard to women. Imagine telling women that whatever difficulties they face, the appropriate response is to stop talking about it and handle it, that emotional expression is weakness, that asking for support is failure, that the measure of a real woman is her ability to absorb pain silently while continuing to perform at full capacity. We would recognize that as a harmful, destructive standard immediately, because it is. When applied to men, it is equally harmful and equally destructive. The evidence is in the suicide statistics, the mental health statistics, the life expectancy gap, the isolation rates, the homelessness numbers. Men are paying with their lives for a standard that nobody would tolerate if applied to anyone else. Here is what the mirror shows. Every situation we examined, the draft, workplace deaths, the mortality gap, sentencing disparities, family court, educational decline, suicide rates, homelessness, violence victimization, media portrayal, the man-up standard, every single one would generate immediate, organized, comprehensive social response if the people experiencing it were women. We know this not as speculation but as observed fact. We have seen how society responds to female disadvantage when it is named and organized around. None of that has happened for men, not because the problems are smaller. By most measures, they are larger. Not because the suffering is less real. Not because the social cost is less significant. Because men's suffering has been excluded from the frameworks through which our society identifies injustice and responds to it. Men do not organize effectively on their own behalf. They do not march. They do not build the political coalitions that translate suffering into policy response. They were taught their whole lives that doing so is weakness, that their pain does not warrant that kind of attention, that real men handle their problems quietly and alone. So the problems persist and grow. This is not a call to take anything away from women. Female suffering is real and deserves the serious response it receives. But the test of whether our commitment to reducing human suffering is genuine is whether we can extend the same urgency and concern to men that we extend to women when the numbers are equivalent or worse. By that test, we are currently failing men, systematically, consistently, across nearly every domain of life where men face disadvantage or suffer at scale. The standard of concern we apply to women is the right standard. That same standard should apply to men, not because men and women are identical, Because human suffering is human suffering. A society that applies different standards of urgency based on the gender of the person suffering is not living up to its own stated values. The mirror has shown us what we look like. What we do with that image is the only question that remains. Drop a comment. Tell me which of these double standards has affected your life most directly and whether anyone in your life has ever acknowledged it as the injustice it actually is. Subscribe to Relational Map. Every week, Miss Eleanor brings you the conversations that need to be had in the language they deserve, without softening the truth to make it more comfortable for people who prefer not to see it.